First off, I painted the base for the sword with a mix of flat black and emerald, with the emerald being just 10% of the mix, because I still want it to look very dark. So next up, we're gonna block out all the areas we want to have some shiny reflections on them, and with that I will use the Stegadon Scale Green. So this is a good way to know where you are heading without making a lot of unnecessary work. So we are going to block out several paints before we making transitions between them all. And you can ignore me painting the bottom of the sword, because that will be repainted later on in the tutorial. I was trying a little glazing effect when that was painted with a purple paint, but it didn't go really as planned. I think I would need an airbrush and a little bit of a redder paint. But yeah, more experiments in the future with that. So when we blocked out our blue areas, we will proceed painting out a brighter one that is a little bit smaller than the previous painted one. So we'll do a 50-50 mix of the Stegadon Scale Green and the pale blue-gray from the Vallejo model color. So I also add water to all the paints to thin them down, so I can move them around easier onto the surface. But I use no glazes at this stage, just to make sure that they cover fairly well, since this is a blocking technique. And the effect is gonna stretch out a little bit further after we're starting to make some glazed transitions between all the different colors. So if something doesn't get exactly on point and place, no worries about that. You can always fix it later in those transition and blending stages. Now with our paints blocked out nicely, we will start blocking out with some of the pale blue-gray as well. And I add just a little hint of the previous mixture to this, not much at all. You don't need to if you don't want to. Just a thing I did here. So in the same manner, just leaving a little bit of the previous blue paint visible. So you can see these 3 steps here coming off from the sword. It doesn't really look any shiny at all yet. It looks like actually those armies were pretty decent though, but I've seen armies painted like this entirely in tournaments, but they were pretty nice. But I leave it up to me to tell you what I think this looks like.
Alright, so we can start blending now. You see, the sword really looks like shit right now.
So as you just heard, I didn't really like that look of the sword, but that's why we'll fix it with some blends. So we'll take some of the Stegadon Scale Green again, and we'll start adding some glaze to this, so we can combine all these hard edges together. So I zoomed in a little bit on the sword here. As you can see, I'm carefully making long brush strokes along all the areas of paint, just to combine them together, so they get a little bit of the same look with the same glazed paint over them. I'm also focusing a little bit on the hard edges of each paint to smooth them out and blend them together. And this will take some time, of course, and I will jump back and forth between the different paints. And don't worry about cleaning your brush in between each paint. It doesn't really matter because a little bit of mixture in, for say, the Stegadon Scale Green with the pale blue gray, or the mixed pale blue gray with the Stegadon Scale Green, it doesn't hurt the procedure of blending this down to an even, smooth transition to the dark. So therefore, I almost welcome it instead. Actually, it makes the process a little bit easier for you. So you can kind of mix the paint onto the model itself if you want to. It helps sometimes. So I could recommend that. I'll do it a little in this video. I don't know if you can see it, but yeah. So now I'll go back with a little bit of the Stegadon Scale Green to darken things down just somewhat. And it also helps the previous paint job to getting a little bit smoother and bring back some of that original blue tone to it all. So if you feel that your sword is getting too pale, you just go back with the Stegadon Scale Green and give it a go again with some glazes. That's actually a very good technique when painting things in general. If you feel that it's losing its touch, then you can always go back with your mid-tone or your base tone and glaze it down quite a lot and just give it a very smooth and thin layer. It's barely visible, but gives it back that hint of the original color. I usually do that with reds. If they get too orange or too beige, then you would want to do that. So yeah, just continue blending this up and going back to some of the brighter paints. You can see I am painting over some of the brighter areas, but I will refill them later on with some more pale blue-gray, of course. So this can be a pretty tedious process, going back and forth between all the paints, but that's why it's good to do the basics of blocking out where all the areas of light is going to be. It helps all these glazes. And glazing up from scratch with no blocks is that's quite hard actually. So you want to use fairly thick paint to start off with and do the blocking technique. Or use an airbrush, of course. That also works when painting swords like this. So now I'll take the pale blue-gray and start highlighting the ends of the light areas. And you can see we're bringing back that sharp light of the sword now, before we will give it the final touches. I'll also highlight the edges here, because it's a classic look to a power or magical sword in order to give it that sharpness and frame out all the detailing. One more thing about glazing is that when you add glaze or water to a paint, it's hard to tell you the right amount of ratio that I use each time, because I just dab my brush in the little pool and add each time. So it's something you have to get a feeling for yourself and find out what works for you with each paint, because in the end we might not use the same brush techniques and such, so it's important to practice this. If you wonder why I never say this is how and how this is how much glaze I use for this and this, because it's very hard to keep track of that. So for the last steps, we're going to work with a lot of ivory. I'm gonna make some key points with this, as we did with the other paints, just very small ones this time. And I'm gonna also make some small transitions with the ivory, so we're gonna glaze it down a little bit later. And also I'm going to highlight all the edges one more time with pure pale blue gray. So we want to keep working around the points of ivory with the glazed down ivory, so we can make a smooth transition into the rest of the sword with this. You want to keep working with this in several layers until you're satisfied with the result. So this will take a little bit of time, but it will be achieved fairly quick when you get used to it. So with some pale gray blue, we will tie the sword together now and make it look a bit sharper. So we make all those transitions we recently painted out pop a little bit more. So with the highlights done, we can now move on to making some finalized touches on the blends and such, where we think we made some errors, and then we can call the blade ready. So next up we can paint the demonic corruption that's running up from the bottom of the sword. So for the base of the sword, I painted out the demonic corruption details with a base of Screamer Pink. Nothing too fancy there, just flat base. So our goal here is to make it look like this side here onto the sword, and that's going to require a little bit of shadows and highlights, of course. So we're going to start off painting it with some despair green. As I mentioned before, the Terradon Turquoise is equivalent to the despair green in regards of shading. So you can see here the paints are quite similar. The despair green is a little bit more bluer though. So they're not 100%, but I think they do the same job when it comes to painting out details that want a little bit of a blue-green shadow to them. So we're gonna push the paint down into the resist areas of the corruption details, and this would be a very glazed down version of the despair green, so it doesn't come on too strong to the Screamer Pink, because you still want the two colors to blend a little bit. You want the Screamer Pink to shine through just a little onto the despair green. So you can kind of work the gradients with the despair green. If you want a little bit more intense of shadow, you can do that, or if you want a little bit less, you can also do that. It's a wonderful thing when it's a little bit glazed down. And of course I push on several layers to make some deeper and darker areas as well. Now we're gonna brighten up the mutations a little bit, and we're gonna do that with some pink horror. this is a neat paint from the Citadel range that I use quite often when doing corrupted skins and such. So one of my favorite paints from that range. And I want to highlight the upper parts of the mutations here, or the corruption, or whatever you want to call them, and leave a little bit of the Screamer Pink and the Despair Green showing. So we don't want the Screamer Pink to be the only color showing, and then we get to the Despair Green, then you get that little sudden break effect that looks kind of off. You want it still to be a soft transition between the three paints. And so you also need, as I said before, to choose the direction of where the highlights are going to be. So I've chosen to highlight them at the top of all the details. So I won't do any from underneath. We start highlighting this with some Salmon Rose, and we're gonna make fairly small lines with this onto our previous painted pink horror. We want them to be at the crisp edges of the details as well, because as I said before, we still want all the other colors to still showing a little bit, so we don't get that sudden jump effect of a sudden break in the paint. And this was fairly hard to do under the camera, because I don't want to break off from the camera view. Always the struggle when making movies. So I think in the end that my other side of the sword got a little bit better on the mutation side, but I think that this side of the sword got a little better regarding the blue power feeling to the sword. So both sides got some good aspects and some not so good aspects. Still look good though, but could be a little bit better, of course. So what I could have done is that I went back with some pink horror or Screamer Pink and work up the bridges between all the other paints a little bit more, and sort of blend them a bit more together. So that's how I could solve that problem. But yeah, that's something you can try if you feel that you got too much of one paint or the other. And you can just go back and reglaze with one of the mid-tones or base paints. Lastly, I make a mix of Icy Yellow and the Ivory paints from the Vallejo model color range. I'll make this about a 50-50 mix, because these are going to be our highest points of highlights onto the corruption or the mutation details. That's going up on the bottom of the sword here. So I'm just going to highlight at the tip of each surface that I have painted to be lighter. I got a little bit out of focus here in the camera view, but I hope you still can see this. So you can see that I am painting out the middle of a layered highlight, or if we are at an edge, I just paint the tip with this. And as I talked before, the key to this whole thing is to make very crisp and small lines. And that's how you get that more detailed look that I got onto the other side of the sword. But I think this still looks great. It looks kind of fleshy, and yeah, you can see that the other side got a little bit more crisp in the highlights. But if you got some Emperor Children, Slaanesh Noise Marines, Demons, or maybe some Tyranids, I think this will work great on those kind of miniatures. So if you enjoy these tutorials, I'll see you in the next one.